Frog respiration. Respiratory system is comprised of the organs that help in the intake and supply of oxygen to the tissues as well as to get rid of excess carbon dioxide. Branchial respiration occurs in case of tadpoles or larval stage. The gills are the primary respiratory organ in branchial respiration which occurs in tadpoles or larval stages. The branchial respiration, it takes by means of external gills. Amphibians, they survive both in land as well as on water. The younger ones, the larval stage, they lead a life in water and they use the gills as the respiratory organ when they are in water. Once the tadpole undergoes metamorphosis, the respiratory system also changes. Respiration in adult frog occurs through three different ways. The first one is cutaneous respiration. It takes place through moist surface of outer skin. The skin is usually slimy. It is kept slimy and respiration takes place through skin. Buccal respiration, it takes place through lining of buccopharyngeal cavity. Pulmonary respiration, it takes place through lungs. In each of the above cases, there are numerous blood capillaries lying close to the epithelium. Because exchange of gas has to take place between these capillary tubes and the outer surface. Oxygen diffuses in and carbon dioxide diffuses out of these capillaries into the external environment. Cutaneous respiration in frog. Cutaneous respiration takes place all the time whether frog is in or out of water. When the frog is underwater or hibernating, it is the only mode of respiration, and frogs usually hibernate, and this is the process when they hibernate. There is rich supply of blood in the skin and it is permeable to gases. The capillaries, there's a rich supply of capillaries and these capillaries are permeable to gases. So easily oxygen diffuses in and carbon dioxide diffuses out. Oxygen must first dissolve in a moist surface before it diffuses into blood. This is also one of the reasons for frogs to stay near water and keep their skin moist. The mucous glands also secrete mucus so that the skin doesn't dry out of water. Movement is not required in cutaneous respiration as skin remains exposed to air or water and there is direct diffusion of gases that take place. Buccal respiration in frog. In buccal respiration on land, the mouth stays permanently closed while the nostrils remain open. The floor of the buccal cavity is alternately raised and lowered, and this buccal cavity, the cavity within the mouth, is known as buccal cavity. When the frog is on land, usually it is buccal respiration that takes place. Here mouth remains closed but the nostrils are open, and since the buccal cavity is alternately raised and lowered, when it allows the air to be drawn into and expelled out of the buccal cavity repeatedly through the open nostrils. The glottis remains closed during buccal respiration. It is done so that no air enters or leaves the lungs into buccal cavity. The mucous epithelial lining of buccal cavity is rich in blood capillaries which absorbs oxygen in the air and gives out carbon dioxide. Pulmonary respiration and sound production in frog. The breathing that takes place on land in the atmospheric air by the help of lungs is termed as pulmonary respiration. In case of frogs, the lungs are poorly developed. Thus, the insufficient supply of oxygen obtained through lungs is supplemented by the moist skin and buccal cavity. So this is what happens. Air enters in when it is respiring through lungs. Pulmonary respiration occurs. Air enters in through mouth region. It enters into through mouth region, reaches the buccal cavity, then glottis is closed. It enters into the pocket of buccal cavity. When the glottis is open, glottis opens, elastic recoil of lungs and compression of chest wall reduces lung volume, so air is forced out of the lungs and out of the mouth and nares. Mouth and nares close, floor of buccal cavity rises, air is pushed into lungs. So what air is stored within the buccal cavity, that is again pushed into the lungs because there is no opening. The mouth and the nostril is closed. Now what happens is glottis closes, gaseous exchange occurs within lungs. That is how pulmonary respiration is carried out. Respiratory organs of frog. The main organ of aerial respiration are the two lungs. The passage through which the air enters and then leaves the lung is termed as respiratory tract. And the respiratory tract, it consists of external nostrils, internal nostrils, the nasal chambers. Buccopharyngeal cavity, the glottis, the laryngotracheal chamber, the two bronchi. And on the floor of pharynx, the median slit-like glottis is present. Glottis opens into larynx. Larynx or laryngotracheal chamber is a thin-walled chamber. It has cartilages support the walls of larynx. Its inner lining forms a pair of elastic horizontal bands which is called the vocal cords. Vocal cords are for sound production. So larynx is also called as voice box. The characteristic croaking is produced because of the vibrations formed when the air from lungs it is forced outside. The tension of the cords can be changed by special muscles, hence changing the pitch of the sound during croaking could be heard. Only male frogs have vocal sacs so as to amplify the croaking sacs. The vocal sacs actually amplify the croaking sound when air is forced out of lungs. From larynx, bronchus leads to each lung. Bronchus, it is a very small tube. Lungs are ovoid in structure. They are thin-walled and highly elastic sacs. They are suspended freely inside the peritoneal body cavity, one on either side of the heart. Peritoneum covers the lungs externally. Visceral peritoneum covers the lung externally. The inner surface of each lung, it is divided by septa into many smaller air sacs which are known as alveoli, leaving a clear large central cavity. The alveoli, they are lined by thin epithelium, and this epithelium is richly supplied by blood capillaries that contain deoxygenated blood for gaseous exchange. Oxygen in the inhaled air diffuses to blood, whereas carbon dioxide is released into alveoli from air. It has to be pushed out. Inspiration. The frog closes its glottis and mouth while drawing air into lungs. In this phase, nostrils remain open. Now the sternohyal muscles contract. This contraction allows the hyoid apparatus and floor of buccal cavity to be lowered. The buccal cavity is enlarged. When the buccal cavity is lowered, air pushes into that buccal cavity, to the space of the buccal cavity. The buccal cavity is enlarged and the air is drawn into the buccal cavity through the nostrils. When the buccal cavity increases its size, the pressure within the buccal cavity is lowered and the atmospheric pressure is high. So what happens? Air moves from a region of higher pressure to a region of lower pressure. So since the buccal cavity is lowered and the buccal chamber increases in size, the pressure within the buccal chamber is lowered and air rushes in through the nostrils into this buccal chamber. Now what happens is the glottis opens and the mendomaxillian bones of lower jaw that push upwards and the premaxillary bones of upper jaw. This closes the nostrils. Now the nostrils become closed. Then the pterygohyal muscle contracts, which raises the hyoid apparatus and floor of buccal cavity. Now buccal cavity, the volume of buccal cavity is reduced. This forces the compressed air through the open glottis into the. Now air has to move somewhere because the space is less. So what happens? That air moves into the lungs. This process by which lungs are filled with air is called inspiration. It is known as inspiration. Expiration, the glottis closes when lungs are filled with air. For some time, air is held in the lungs, during which buccal floor is repeatedly raised and lowered to carry on buccal respiration. Soon the glottis opens. The air in the lungs are driven out into the buccal cavity by lowering its flow. It is aided by the elasticity of lungs and contraction of the body muscles. The glottis closes when the buccal floor is raised again. Now the air, since the chamber again becomes, the volume reduces and the glottis is closed. Now this time air is forced out through the nostrils to outside. This process by which the lungs are emptied is called expiration. Here the carbon dioxide rich air now which is filling the buccal chamber, that is pushed out the nostrils.